Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
This afternoon, the President is looking forward to officially announcing the new chairman of his Board of Advisors for the White House Initiative on Historically Black Colleges and Universities. Johnny C. Taylor, Jr., who will be taking on this important role, is the former president of the Thurgood Marshall College Fund and is currently CEO of the Society for Human Resource Management. As you all know, the President previously signed an executive order promoting excellence and innovation at HBCUs. He believes this initiative will advance America's full human potential, and with today's announcement, he continues to demonstrate his commitment to HBCUs. Before taking your questions, I want to take a moment to highlight the historic obstruction by Senate Democrats, an issue that represents a threat to America's interests and security. Compared to the 4 previous administrations, this Senate has confirmed the fewest nominees. Senator Schumer's tactics have led to 73 fewer confirmations than the next closest administration. Half of President Trump's nominees are still waiting for confirmation in the Senate. The obstruction is so out of control, even some Senate Democrats believe it is inappropriate. Senator Amy Klobuchar, a Democrat from Minnesota, said, quote, "I don't believe we should be holding nominees hostage. Enough is enough. We need people who are qualified to fill these important positions in our government. In the coming days, we'll be highlighting specific qualified nominees who are, as the senator said, being held hostage by Senator Schumer. Take, for instance, Rick Grinnell, the president's nominee to serve as ambassador to Germany. Mr. Grinnell, a Harvard-educated, experienced diplomat, was the longest-serving U.S. spokesperson at the United Nations. He was nominated in September of last year. He was reported out of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee with bipartisan support. He is waiting to represent America's interest and be our country's top voice in a G7 country." In short, Senator Schumer's hyper-political delay on Mr. Grinnell puts our national security and America's foreign policy interests in jeopardy. The Senate should move to confirm him immediately. We will continue highlighting more of these examples of Democrat obstruction in the days ahead. Finally, I'm sure, on a lighter note, I'm sure you all remember 11-year-old Natalie Dalton, who wrote into the President offering to cook for him. We're excited to announce today that Natalie and her 8-year-old cousin, Celia, will be coming to the White House on March 23rd to work with the White House kitchen staff. We look forward to hosting them, and with that, I will take your questions. John.
Sarah, Admiral Mike Rogers, the head of the NSA, said that he has not been granted any additional authority by the President to confront Russian cyber intrusion, interference with our election systems. Why has he not been given that authority?
Look, just this week they announced through the State Department that $40 million is being given to the Global Engagement Center to begin providing immediate support to private and public partners that expose and counter Russian and Chinese propaganda and disinformation. We're focused on looking at a variety of different ways. As I told you last week, Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen met with a number of both state, local, and federal officials working on ways that we can best prevent things like this in the future, and we're looking at a number of different options, and we're going to continue doing that over the coming weeks.
But Admiral Rogers is the one that would have the agency that could actually go and confront Russian intrusion at the source, and he hasn't been given the authority. In fact, he says that the Russians haven't paid a sufficient price to make them change their behavior. He's the one with the power, with the means to do it. All he needs is a presidential directive, the authority from the president to do it.
I disagree with the premise of your question. It's not just one individual. It's looking at a number of different ways.
He's in charge of Cyber Command. Why not give him the authority?
Nobody is denying him the authority. We're looking at a number of different ways that we can put pressure. Look, this president, as I told you last week, has been much tougher on Russia than his predecessor. Let's not forget that this happened under Obama. It didn't happen under President Trump. If you want to blame somebody on past problems, then you need to look at the Obama administration. The president is looking at all of the different causes and all of the different ways that we can prevent it, and as we find different ways that we can do that, we're implementing them. Like you see with the money that was allocated from the State Department, as you see with the conversations that the secretary from the DHS is having, we're going to continue looking at different ways to combat it, and I would imagine that that will be certainly a big part of it, but I can't speak to anything further on it right now.
This is not about the past, though. This is not about the past. It's about protecting intrusion in the next election.
Exactly.
And he says he needs the authority, and he hasn't been given it.
Well, I can't speak to that specifically. I can tell you that we are taking a number of steps to prevent this, and we're looking at a variety of other ways that we're going to continue to implement over the coming weeks and months. Justin?
I had one on the renewable fuel credit, but first, just a housekeeping one on clearances. The Oversight Committee requested details from the White House about still pending clearances among White House staffs and whether there's any derogatory information. They set a deadline of tomorrow. The Senate Judiciary Committee sent a letter over today asking for some of the same information. I'm wondering if the White House is going to plans to comply with those requests, and if I know you've been hesitant to release some of that information, even in aggregate.
I haven't been hesitant. I've been very clear that we don't discuss security clearances. And that's not changing today. It didn't change yesterday. It's not going to change tomorrow. So probably not going to change next week. I didn't say that. I said I'm not going to discuss security clearances with members of the press. And that hasn't been different at any point during this administration. And we have no intention of changing it right now.
Well, are you going to comply with those?
I'll let you know when we have a chance to review that and make a decision.
But can I do the fuel standard question? Yeah, you guys put out a statement today saying that the president supports the renewable fuel credit, but also that he is supportive of energy producers. So it seems that the issue here is whether or not the president of the White House supports a cap to lower the cost of credit waivers. So I'm wondering if you could tell us what the president's position is on that.
Look, the president knows that there are a lot of differing views on this issue. We're going to continue having conversations. He met today with Senators Cruz, Ernst, Grassley, and Toomey to discuss this and to continue that conversation. They had a productive meeting, and we're going to continue working with not only those members but others as we go through this process. John?
Two questions, different topics. If I could return to something that we talked about yesterday, the president's support to raise the minimum age for buying a long gun from 18 to 21. He expressed support for that idea in a tweet last Thursday. He talked about it with the students from Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. Didn't mention it at CPAC, didn't mention it with the governors, said he had lunched with Wayne LaPierre.
To be fair, of all of the governors when that conversation was opened, none of them mentioned it either, but in a 2-hour discussion.
But he had supported it. So. He had lunch with Wayne LaPierre and Chris Cox. The NRA remains firmly opposed to this idea of raising the age for long guns. The president said yesterday, if they're not always with you, sometimes you got to fight them. Is he willing to take on the NRA on this idea of raising the minimum age for buying a long gun?
The president still supports raising the age limit to 21 for the purchase of certain firearms. We're meeting with bipartisan members of Congress tomorrow. We expect that to be a topic of discussion. He knows that everybody doesn't necessarily agree. We're not going to get into the details on the specifics of what we will propose, but we expect that to be part of the conversation tomorrow.
Question number 2 on the unrelated topic. Jeff Sessions confirmed a few minutes ago that he is going to open an investigation into FISA abuses during the election. The president clearly has been expressing that he believes that Sessions should look into this. Is the president happy now that Sessions is opening this investigation?
I haven't spoken with him to determine his feelings, but as you said, it's something that he's clearly had frustration over. So I would imagine he certainly supports the decision to look into what we feel to be some wrongdoing. I think that's the role of the Department of Justice, and we're glad that they're fulfilling that job. Margaret?
Sarah, I have one question, but one housekeeping item before that. You talked about nominations and how slow Congress is to move. I'm wondering, do you have a timeline on when the White House will name a nominee to be ambassador to South Korea?
I don't have a timeline, and I don't have any personnel announcements on that position specifically.
Okay. And then the question I had, again, going back to Admiral Rogers, he said today, we are not where we need to be or want to be on cyber. Does the White House, does the president plan to hold a National Security Council session to discuss specifically these concerns about having a menu of options to respond to a cyber attack, and one specifically in relation to Russia?
In terms of a specific meeting, I don't know that a date is set, but I do know that there are constantly conversations going on within the administration on this topic, and we're going to continue those. I'll keep you posted on the president's schedule.
Has there been one so far on Russia and cyber attacks?
I know that he's been briefed on it. In terms of specifics beyond that, I'd have to check and get back to you. Jordan?
Thank you, Sarah. Did anyone from the White House instruct Hope Hicks not to answer questions from the House Intelligence Committee about her time serving in the White House and the transition?
As is always the case, I'm not going to comment on any individual's interactions with the committee, but we are cooperating because, as the president has said repeatedly, there is no collusion, and we're going to continue to cooperate. Hopefully they'll wrap this up soon.
Why did you refuse to answer the question?
Again, I'm not going to comment on any individual specific interactions with the committee. I'd refer you to outside attorneys for that. John?
Thanks a lot, Sarah. I just want to pick up on what Jordan was just asking you, and that is about this idea of citing executive privilege for conversations that took place during the transition period. We're told that's exactly what Hope Hicks, the communications director, cited in refusing to answer questions that were posed of her related to the transition period. Is the president aware, is the White House aware that no federal court at any level has ever granted that privilege pertaining to the transition period?
Just because we asked the question in different ways, I'm still not going to comment on any individual's interactions with the committee. I'm also not going to comment on leaks from what is supposed to be a confidential setting. There continues to be zero evidence of collusion, and we hope these investigations wrap up shortly. Steve?
To follow up on what Margaret was asking, Joseph Yoon, the State Department's envoy to North Korea, is retiring. How does that impact the diplomatic process?
Look, we're going to continue appointing people to different positions, whether it's the ambassador of South Korea and a number of other positions. I don't have any specific announcements on it at this time.
Secondly, the Chinese economic minister is here for trade talks. As you consider tariffs on steel and aluminum, what do you hope to hear from this fellow?
He's meeting with a few different members of the administration, but not the president directly. I don't have any specific readouts from any of his meetings at this point.
Sarah, thank you very much. House Speaker Ryan today disagreed with the president on arming teachers. He says he thinks it should be up to the locals whether teachers should be armed. What is the president's response to not having support from the Republican leader of the House?
Look, as we've said, this is something that will continue to be part of the discussion with state, federal, and local officials, as well as law enforcement. The president's going to be meeting with bipartisan lawmakers tomorrow, and that'll be another one of those topics discussed, and we'll have further specific policy announcements later this week.
But without the support of Speaker Ryan, how can this get any traction in the House?
Again, this is part of an ongoing conversation. It's something that the president still supports. It's something he knows that there are a lot of differing views on. It's one of the topics that we expect to come up tomorrow, and we're going to continue having that discussion. I think the number one thing that we're looking at is every possible action that we can take that helps protect the safety and security of the school kids across this country. We're going to look at everything we can. A lot of those things that you guys have brought up today will be part of the discussion tomorrow, and we expect to have some specific policy proposals later this week. Steve?
Yes, Sarah, today the White House announced that it's cutting about $8 million in aid to Cambodia for what it calls recent setbacks in democracy there. Can you talk a little bit about what went into this decision and why specifically just Cambodia and not other countries where there have also been recent setbacks to democracy, such as neighbor Thailand?
The elections that happened earlier this month failed to represent the genuine will of the Cambodian people. That gave us great cause for concern. These setbacks compelled the United States to review that assistance. Based on the review, the government will suspend or curtail several assistance programs intended to support the Cambodian government. I don't have anything further at this point. Anita?
Two questions on two different topics. First, does President Trump believe that the governor of Missouri, who, as you know, has been indicted, should resign?
I haven't spoken with him about that.
Okay, can you go back to
But my guess is that he would refer to the people of the state of Missouri, but I haven't spoken directly with him, so I have to get back to you.
The president's the leader of the Republican Party, and obviously the governor's Republican. Well, I mean, he's a Republican.
Anita, I haven't spoken with him. I'd have to ask him.
Get back to me on that?
Sure.
Okay. Second question. The president's having several meetings, as you mentioned, with lawmakers of both parties this week on other topics. Is he going to be talking to them about immigration? His deadline that he set, March 5th, is next Monday. Congress is nowhere near doing anything about that. Is that still the deadline? Is he encouraging them to get something done?
Absolutely, he's encouraging them to get something done. That's why he laid out exactly what he expected to see in a proposal that would not only help solve the DACA problem, but also provide border security. The president went above and beyond what previous administrations have done and offered on that program. It's really sad that Democrats are not willing to come to the table, get something done, and actually fix problems and do their job. But the president is still hopeful, and we're going to continue pushing forward and hope we get something done.
What's going to happen on Monday when the deadline comes?
Again, we're still hopeful that something happens on this and that Congress will actually do its job. Olivia?
Thank you, Sarah. I've got a couple for you as well. One on North Korea. Joseph Yoon, who's sort of the point person for North Korea policies, announced he's leaving. Does the president plan to replace him?
I don't have any personnel announcements at this time.
And then we're heading into the midterm election year, obviously. Have White House staff been briefed on the do's and don'ts of political activity, including the prohibition on using formal titles in campaign literature?
I know for sure that cabinet and senior staff have been, and I believe a paper memo was distributed to all staff, but I'd have to verify that to be sure. But I know that both cabinet and senior staff have been briefed on upcoming midterm elections and what they are allowed to do and not do.
Thank you, Sarah. Does the president believe someone who's on the no-fly list because of suspected terrorist activity should be able to buy a gun?
We haven't spoken about that specifically and don't have any policy announcement on that front.
I don't want a policy announcement. I just want to know if he thinks
that would be a
somebody
policy, whether or not the president supports something or not would be a policy.
He doesn't know?
I said I haven't spoken with him about it, so I'd have to get back to you. John?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Two brief questions. One, I know it's been announced the president.
He's closer to
That was
I know. I noticed that too. I mean, you're moving up in the world, John, and it scares your colleagues. I think they're making them nervous.
That was just such great timing. He sat down and you called him right there.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Anita.
You're welcome. Got a lot of support, John.
Yeah. Reverend Billy Graham's funeral is this Friday. We know the president will attend. Has it been determined whether he'll make any remarks, any of the eulogies, or will he be just there as a mourner and family friend?
I'm not sure on the specifics. I do know he plans to attend there as well as head to the Capitol tomorrow for that stop. But in terms of specific remarks, I don't have any comment on that at this point.
Right. My other question is that the president's two immediate predecessors did a lot to build and expand the faith-based programs within the White House and throughout the executive branch of government. Many governors followed that example, among them your father. It has been said that this president has not followed through on that there is no faith-based office within the White House now. Your reaction?
Look, I don't think an office is what determines the faith of the administration. I think that we have a number of people. Right. I think that's something that the president has a faith council and a advisory council that regularly come to the White House and meet with. But I think in terms of whether or not you have an office doesn't determine the faith of the administration. I think we probably have actually more people front and center speaking openly about their faith and advocating and helping build on that foundation than probably any previous administration has. Francesca?
Thank you, Sarah. You've mentioned several times that you expect to have some policy announcements later this week. Just want to follow up on that and clarify. Are you saying that this week the White House will have a specific list that would be detailed or an outline of the specific policies that the president would like to see in legislation on gun control, gun violence prevention? Is that what you're saying?
Specific to school safety, yes, we expect that there will be some policy proposals that will be out by the end of the week. As I've noted, a couple yesterday that the president has already voiced and the administration have voiced support for, both the Cornyn legislation as well as the Stop Gun Violence Act. Both are pieces of legislation that the administration supports.
Following up on that, though, you've also said that before the president can support some of those things, he'd like to see what's in the legislative text of those bills. We've talked about universal background checks in here before, but one of the two senators of this bipartisan bill who would be putting this forward says that they're not going to put that back forward until they're certain that they have the president's support for something like that. So conceptually, does the president support the idea of universal background checks, and would he be willing to support Senator Manchin and Senator Toomey's legislation on that?
At this time, the president, the only two specific pieces of legislation that we are announcing support for are the two that I just mentioned. Anything further will come later this week. The president, as I've said, expects to meet with a number of lawmakers tomorrow from both sides of the aisle, and we'll have some more information about specifics after that. Blake?
Thank you. I want to ask you what's happening in Georgia as it relates to Delta Airlines. The background, as I'm sure you know, they withdrew benefits for NRA members, and now the lieutenant governor there is saying that maybe there shouldn't be a tax break for Delta. The lieutenant governor said, quote, corporations cannot attack conservatives and expect us not to fight back. On the narrow front, does the White House believe that conservatives are under attack in the state of Georgia? And more broadly, does the president think it's a good idea for a state government to target a business for retribution for decisions that the business decides that it wants to make?
The administration is focused, when it comes to this conversation, on what we can do to help the safety and security of America's children. That's our focus. We're not weighing into other sidebar conversations right now. Hallie?
Sarah, thanks. I want to ask you about Syria and some developments there, but just two quick clarifications. To Justin's point, when he asked about whether the White House will meet the deadline tomorrow from House Oversight, it sounded like you said you'd let us know when you review it, but Trey Gowdy made that request 2 weeks ago. Have you guys not?
I said I would let you know and get back to you that we don't have any announcement on that at this forum.
And then on John, just to clarify on Jonathan's question here, just simply yes or no, will the president give the authority to Mike Rogers to seek additional authorities to go after Russia?
I'm not going to get ahead of any specific direction by the president, but I can tell you that we are looking at a number of different things that we can do to prevent this from happening, and we're going to continue to be tough on Russia moving forward, just as we have been in this first year.
Okay, on Syria, Sarah, and it sounds like you're open to doing that then. The president's open to those additional authorities?
Open to, I'm sorry, what did you say?
To additional authorities?
The president is open to looking at a number of different ways of making sure that Russia doesn't meddle in our elections.
Speaking of international relations, does the United States have reason to believe that North Korea is linked to Syria's chemical weapons program?
I don't have any comment on that at this point.
Sarah.
Take the last question, Mike.
Just one quick one. First, I want to just button up Steve's question about Lu Ha. You said he's meeting with some administration officials. Do you know who he's meeting with?
We'll get back to you on the specifics of who he's meeting with.
The president mentioned last week that...
But I know it's not the president. I can tell you that.
Okay. The president mentioned last week that John Kelly has a decision to make about Jared Kushner's security clearance. I know your policy on not talking about security clearances, except really in the case of Kushner. You guys have talked about him quite a bit. Has the chief of staff made a decision on John Kelly, and can you say what it is?
As I said earlier, we do not comment on individual security clearances. We actually haven't commented on Jared's, as you indicated, but we have commented on his ability to do his job, which he's a valued member of the team, and he will continue to do the important work that he's been doing since he started in the administration. Thanks so much, guys. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Sarah.
Hi there and welcome to the briefing room. I'm ABC News' Rick Klein, joined here by Johnny Verhoevic and Arlette Saenz. A big day today because the Trump campaign has a campaign manager. We'll get to that in a little bit, but we're going to be joined by John Parkinson over on Capitol Hill in a few moments as well. But I want to start with the big news of the day, outlined again today. Guns, guns, guns. This has continued to be the topic that the White House is being pressed on. We're still not, though, getting any real specifics. There are two sort of small pieces of legislation that they have come out on board for. But other than that, it's still generalities from the White House.
Yeah, the White House really hasn't been specific on what the president supports at this point. They say that he supports expanding the current background check system, enhancing it. But as far as it comes to that question about whether he still supports raising the age on buying long rifles from 18 to 21, the president's been a little bit silent about that in recent days after his lunch with the top leaders over at the NRA. She says that he still, Sarah Sanders says that he still supports that idea, but they're not going to, of raising the age limit on certain weapons, but they're not going to get ahead on any specifics until who knows when.
Yeah, I mean, the word of the day yesterday, and it seems like the word of the day today, is again conversation.
Yeah.
We're having these conversations, we're considering different proposals, but you are starting to see, and I'm sure our colleague John Parkinson can talk about this, we are starting to see some bills. was introduced. We're starting to see, certain, proposals put forth, and you heard Sarah Sanders say there's going to be some ink to paper at some point this week in talking about certain proposals. But when it actually comes to what the president's priorities are on this and what he would actually support, it's still pretty murky.
Yeah, they've delayed this, and there's been reports in the last couple of days that maybe he's backing away from the idea of changing age limits.
Right.
That Sarah Sanders saying not so much, but until we see an actual bill, it's impossible to know whether we're talking about Trump versus the NRA or Trump with the NRA on the same team.
That's right, and really there's all these different bills that are being put forth in Congress, and it's also a big question, is anything actually going to get any traction and movement up there on Capitol Hill?
Well, this week on Capitol Hill is actually a very short week because of the Billy Graham funeral later in the week. I want to ask our colleague John Parkinson, who's been tracking all these developments and much more. There's a press in the Senate, Senator Rubio trying to get that Fix Nix bill that you just heard the White House again express support for. This is the bipartisan John Cornyn and Chris Murphy legislation. But there's been some blowback even among his fellow Republicans and also some Democrats who don't want to see it come up if it's going to be that in a vacuum. John, what's the prospect of any action on guns on Capitol Hill this week?
I still think that that's really a long shot. I think that Senator McConnell would really have to go through regular order to get any sort of activity, and that would really be a process that would play out over days. As you mentioned, Marco Rubio is trying to push forward on his ideas and seeking for unanimous consent on the background check bill. But Senator Mike Lee of Utah is so far objecting to consent. And so at this point, we really don't think that that's going to be rushed up onto the floor. As you said, tomorrow, Billy Graham is really going to be taking the focus away. The House is out at the end of today and will not have votes the rest of the week. So really, the House sent over a bill on December 6th here into the Senate. It is that background check bill with concealed to carry and also a provision in there to direct the Department of Justice to take action on bump stocks. But those bills, really, that combined force is not going to carry through the Senate, and we really need to see movement on the background checks bill alone to get it advanced.
Yeah, we heard from House Speaker Paul Ryan today for the first time on this. He's been sort of quiet in the wake of Parkland with them back in session. But guys, it's just hard to imagine Congress moving without the White House direction on this. We know what the paralysis, the stalemate around this has been. You heard a little bit of questioning in the briefing a few minutes ago about the chicken and egg problem that you have here. If the White House can't comment until they see legislative text, you've got legislators who say, I don't want to act unless we know we have the White House on board.
And tomorrow we do expect that there will be a bipartisan meeting with lawmakers over at the White House, as Sarah mentioned in the briefing, and perhaps there will be some progress that's made in that front as far as hearing more ideas as they continue this conversation about what exactly the president's going to get behind.
And I will say, I'll go back to the poll numbers. You see 70% of Americans wanting stricter gun legislation. We saw some students from Parkland on Capitol Hill today. This is an issue, and this is a time where it feels like this issue is not going to leave the national consciousness anytime soon.
So two big Russia-related headlines that are popping today. One is Hope Hicks, who's the longtime White House communications director, called onto Capitol Hill to talk to the House Intelligence Committee. We're going to talk about that in a minute, but I was really struck by something that the NSA director, Admiral Mike Rogers, had to say earlier today. He said that they haven't been given any new directives in terms of confronting cyber warfare from Russia, that they have not been made to punish. He says he's waiting for directives from the White House. Take a look at what John Karl, our colleague, our chief White House correspondent, said with Sarah Sanders kicking off today's briefing a few minutes ago.
But Admiral Rogers is the one that would have the agency that could actually go and confront Russian intrusion at the source, and he hasn't been given the authority. In fact, he says that the Russians haven't paid a sufficient price to make them change their behavior. He's the one with the power, with the means to do it. All he needs is a presidential directive, the authority from the president to do it.
I disagree with the premise of your question. It's not just one individual. It's looking at a number of different ways.
He's in charge of Cyber Command. Why not give him the authority?
Nobody is denying him the authority. We're looking at a number of different ways that we can put pressure. Look, this president, as I told you last week, has been much tougher on Russia than his predecessor. Let's not forget that this happened under Obama. It didn't happen under President Trump.
And through the magic of television, John Karl joins us now directly from outside the White House. John, you heard from Mike Rogers. He was very clear on this. He says he hasn't gotten the authority. That is some twisted logic from the White House saying he hasn't been denied the authority. And by the way, it was Obama's fault.
Yeah, I tell you, I don't think they quite had the answer down on this because as I went on to ask,
okay, this isn't about the past, this is about our next election. Rogers was very clear that the threat is real, that the Russians have not been deterred in any way from trying to meddle again, and he has not been given the authority. He was crystal clear to go at the Russians at the source, and he says without that authority from the Pentagon through the from the president through the Pentagon, he cannot do that. So I don't know. I mean, she said, hey, look, there's a lot of different things they can do. She mentioned some meetings they're going to have and some various other measures, but he's the guy that ultimately has the control of Cyber Command and the National Security Agency. And he's the one that can do this.
And we should note a few things. One is the 2018 elections have already begun. Early voting has already started in primaries. We've got the Texas elections next week. We have an election tonight in Arizona, another big one in Pennsylvania in a couple weeks. It's happening right now, and we've heard from all government officials and congressional officials, the Russians are still at it. They're still trying to do this stuff. And I think the broader piece of this, John, is the way that this White House has handled all things Russia, not imposing those sanctions despite the major congressional support. And it doesn't seem like from the president himself that there is that sort of urgency. Once again today, he's back on Twitter talking about witch hunts regarding the Mueller investigation.
There's been very tough talk from members of his administration, including at the podium. Sarah Sanders herself has been pretty tough on the Russians at time. His Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson. We've heard the administration sound a tough line against the president, against Russia, and in some cases actually take some tough actions against Russia, but nothing from the president himself. And then on the big questions, doing something more aggressively to combat Russian interference in the elections, imposing those sanctions that Congress has already passed and given the president authority to do so, and they haven't acted. It is a bit of a mystery.
And finally, John, before we let you go, Hope Hicks was on Capitol Hill today. We heard, according to our colleague Ben Siegel, the verb was banned. They felt banned, stiffed in committee with not a lot of answers actually emanating from Hope Hicks. This is still, the White House has still not figured out quite how they're handling this question of privilege, but it doesn't seem like administration officials, current White House officials, are giving very much at all up on Capitol Hill when they're asked about anything involving the various investigations.
Yeah, Bannon was the vanguard on this. Bannon was the first to go in there, and there have been many, senior people in this White House that have gone before the committees and answered questions. When Bannon was called, he refused to answer questions about what he did in the White House and during the transition, citing not quite executive privilege, but reserving the White House's ability to invoke executive privilege in consultation with White House lawyers, and now apparently Hope Hicks has done that. Although we asked Sarah Sanders if there had been a directive from the White House saying that Hope could not answer the questions, and she did not answer that. But it appears that she did the exact same thing as Bannon. The important thing here, though, Rick, as you know, Bannon answered questions extensively in terms of the Mueller investigation, and so has Hope Hicks. That is where the real fire in this is because they cannot invoke executive privilege when it comes to the Mueller investigation. So they can avoid questions before the committees. They cannot avoid the questions unless they want to come out and take the fifth. They cannot avoid questions from Mueller, the special counsel.
And John Carl, formally now, no one is denying you the right to go back inside that briefing room and go prepare for World News Tonight. So that, just let that be known. No one is keeping you from that or anything.
Thank you. All right. Good luck.
Thanks, John. I want to hit just briefly John Parkinson on this point of Hope Hicks, because I feel like there's been a lot of anticipation around this. It was delayed once before. What was the sense walking the halls today about the answers they did or didn't get from the White House Communications Director?
Yeah, just talking to a couple of members, throughout the day as they were leaving the committee hearing, they were really disappointed. I think that they weren't shocked by any means, but really to have the chance to answer questions in a closed setting, they were hopeful that Hope Hicks would be forthcoming. It sounds like from what all the intelligence that we're getting out of the Intel Committee is that really she has not been today.
All right, John Parkinson on Capitol Hill, thanks for being here today. Guys, as I mentioned, it is a re-election announcement, sort of. This is a strange one in so many ways. First of all, we should note it's 2018. Sure. It's long before even the midterms, when you sort of kick up into presidential high gear. The president actually filed for re-election on the day of his inauguration. Yeah. But now we have a campaign manager, and his name is Brad Parscale. Maybe not a household name, although if you follow political news, you're pretty familiar with the guy that ran the digital operation for Donald Trump, very close to Jared Kushner, earned a spot in the inner circle. First of all, Arlette, why today? Why now here at the end of it's so weird.
I'm still not even sure why it was today. I mean, we had that Drudge Report shocking announcement coming, and then it was that he's running for president again, as we already anticipated, and that Brad Parscale would be running it. You know, he was the mastermind behind that digital operation, which was really credited with helping Trump secure that victory. But still, it's not clear why today, February 27, 2018, was the day to tout that.
And let's be clear, this is a president who's been running for re-election pretty much since day one. I mean, he's held campaign rallies, yet like you said, he filed his 2020 paperwork the inauguration day. So this is not,
You have to imagine this is part of some kind of an effort to quell some questions out there. John Kasich was just on This Week over the weekend with John Karl talking about potentially running for president. Right. We know that internally at the White House there's all the backbiting and all the vying for influence. It seems like the president is just putting his stake down and saying, Brad's my guy, got to go through him, and we'll see if I wonder does Trump's first campaign manager even last to the voting when the primaries begin in New Hampshire and in Iowa? All right, guys, as we bring this in for a landing today, Johnny Verhoeven, what are your final thoughts?
Well, my final thought today is actually an election day. There's an election in Arizona. There's a potential that this seat, which is vacated by Representative Trent Franks, could turn into a competitive race in April in the general election. You've got a Republican candidate there who might win that is caught up in a bit of a scandal now. So I think that's going to be a key result to watch tonight.
Arlette?
And mine is also along the election theme. We knew that Trump would be seeking re-election, and today we learned something we already knew, that Bob Corker is not going to run for re-election. He decided against, he had been kind of asked whether he should maybe enter back into the Tennessee race. He decided against it. He's going to avoid what would have been a really nasty fight with Marsha Blackburn over
one of those weird news days where the president's still running and Bob Corker's still not running.
Exactly.
Both of them equal news. To me, Russia today, the Mike Rogers warning is an alarm bell about what is going on right now. As Johnny and you're also saying, Arlette, the voting's happening. It's not like this is some abstract thing, and there's a lot of concerns from even inside the Trump administration about how it's being handled. Pretty remarkable. That does it for this edition of Briefing Room. For Johnny Verhoeven and Arlette Saenz, I'm Rick Klein. Please download the ABC News app, and we will be back here next time that there's a briefing right here on the Briefing Room.